Hamstring injury and training workshop, hamstring programming. So the objectives of this module are to apply the knowledge and experience of hamstring specific strengthening exercises and learn how to program and add hamstring related strength training into the workouts of clients and athletes. After observation of this presentation, you should then complete the guided practice and review questions, details of which are on the learner management system. So a quick overview of programming goals. So for phase one then, what we're looking at achieving from the programs are trying to optimize the mobility of the hamstrings at both the hip and knee joints, looking at improving basic strength, and then applying some of that basic strength to improving your capacity to perform these movements repeatedly for a period of time. In phase 2 and 3, both of which come under kind of general preparation, the focus then for these phases is trying to increase the strength, in particular the kind of eccentric strength. So again, you wouldn't go straight in really hard straight away. You need to have a gradual progression, but in particular we're looking at trying to just increase the stress on the tissue to improve the strength. And in particular, as we said, the eccentric strength is going to become important because of the kind of deceleration that we'll look at in the specific preparation phases later on. Within this phase as well, we're also looking at trying to optimize bilateral strength. And what that means is we're trying to ensure that the strength between legs is as close as we can get it. Now, you don't have to kind of do all the eccentric training first before you're allowed to move on to kind of bilateral strength training. You can kind of train these things concurrently. We're then again looking at trying to then apply that with improving the your work capacity. Phases 4 to 5 then, we have termed specific preparation. And again, we're then looking at trying to apply this eccentric strength in particular to improve reactive strength, which effectively just means the ability to move from a eccentric to a concentric contraction as quickly and efficiently as possible, and utilizing that stretch shortening cycle. So we want you to be able to apply that strength at speed for both deceleration and force production. We're then looking at applying that also to coordination. So you need to be able to control your kind of limb position, particularly at speed. And then again, as with the previous phases, we're trying to apply that for kind of fast functional capacity. So as we're performing these functional movements such as sprinting, that you can stabilize and both have good reactive strength and good coordination whilst you're doing those for a period of time. So under programming considerations, there's kind of four main things we suppose you can kind of look at. Which, where, how and why. So we're just going to discuss each of these one at a time before we move on to some of the kind of training parameters as well. So in relation to the injury, well, which is the first one? So which hamstring muscle was injured? It is important that you know that. Biceps femoris, as we said, accounts for about 80% of the kind of hamstring injuries. And again, which muscle is also going to lead us to help us to decide how we're going to kind of implement our program. So for example, is it a typical injury, so proximal biceps femoris, or distal medial hamstring injury, or is it more of an atypical presentation? And again, knowing if there's linkage with the adductor magnus, so is the adductor magnus weakness a causative factor for that injury as well? And then we're on to the where. So where on the muscle did the injury occur? As we said, is it more proximal or more distal? That links in with, is it a typical injury for that particular muscle? But also, if the injury was more proximal, which just means it's closer to the hip, then you're going to need to be more cautious when you're doing loading with hip torque exercises. So for example, if you've had a proximal injury, you wouldn't necessarily want to get someone in doing a heavy Romanian deadlift too soon, because it's likely to kind of aggravate it with too much stress. If the injury was more distal, i.e. more closer to the knee, then again, you're going to have to be more cautious with loading on the knee torque exercises. And so with some of the leg curl related stuff, again, you don't want to stress that part of the hamstrings too early. You do need to stress it, you do need to strengthen it, but if you just do it too early, then it's likely to kind of aggravate the injury. On the how, so how did the injury occur? Well, as we said, 2/3 of hamstring injuries are speed related, so there's probably a good bet it occurred at speed. So were they running at maximum velocity? Were they accelerating? Were they decelerating? Was there a change of direction? Or were they not running at kind of full velocity at speed, and was it more fatigue that was the factor in this case? And then we had why did the injury likely occur? And this is where you have to apply a little bit of your detective knowledge to try to figure out the causative factor for the injury. So was it due to maybe poor mobility or poor compliance to the muscle at speed, and it wasn't lengthening as easily as it should do? Is it due to a weak muscle or poor application of power? Is it a limited capacity or poor coordination? Is there a strength imbalance with other muscles? And all of these things may well be causative factors of why one of your hamstring muscles has become injured. So in regards to exercise selection or classification, we can obviously simply classify the exercises just into the two groups. Is there a knee flexion exercise or hip extension exercise? You can further sub-categorize that as with a knee flexion, is the femur fixed and it's the tibia that's moving, or is it the tibia that's fixed and the femur and the rest of the body is moving? Same thing with hip extension, is it the lower body that's fixed, upper body moving, or is it the upper body that's fixed with the lower body moving? So just as a quick exercise, how would you classify these exercises beneath? The Romanian deadlift, reverse back extension, Nordic curls, and the kneeling hamstring curl machine. We'll give you about 20 seconds just to figure out which one is which, and then we'll give you the answers on the next slide. So the Romanian deadlift, well, this is a hip extension exercise with the lower body fixed. The reverse back extension, well, that's a hip extension exercise as well, but with the upper body fixed. Nordic curls, that's knee flexion with the tibia fixed. And then the kneeling hamstring curls is a knee flexion exercise with the femur fixed. So other considerations then. So on the exercise selection, you need to be very considerate with the kind of loading progression so as not to kind of overstress a previously injured area too soon. So you need to follow a logical loading progression model. So here is one. So we may have gone through some of these exercises in a few of the different presentations, but again on application you just need to kind of see how you would apply this well. So rather than starting off maybe with a glute ham raise, which is a big complex exercise and quite stressful for a lot of people, it's quite hard to perform, a logical progression would be to actually start off with a kneeling hip extension on the glute ham device. You can then progress by moving their hips further forward, which will increase the intensity and add a little bit more stress to it. Then you would perform, or you then could progress onto the kind of back extension. So the legs are now straighter, so a little bit more kind of knee torque whilst you're kind of performing that exercise as well. And then progressing on to the razor curls. Nordic curls would then follow that, and then you should be at a point where you can then comfortably perform the kind of glute ham raise. So if we're just using that glute ham device, like I said, you need to kind of follow a logical progression. Most people, or you can almost with everybody, perform a kneeling hip extension. Not everyone can go straight into razor, Nordic curls or glute ham raises. Placement of load is another consideration. So again, you've got to be aware of where you place the load and the effect that that will have when you're performing it. So for example, we could be doing a 20 kilo Romanian deadlift, or the same weight with a Zerka good morning, or the same weight with a good morning with a weight placed on the kind of back. Now the difference between those exercises, although the load is the same, the load on the spinal erectors will actually increase as the lever arm and the distance from the hip actually increases. So as you move from Romanian deadlift to good morning, or Zerka good morning to full good morning, then the load and the stress on the spinal erectors, the rectus spinae, is going to get much harder. Next consideration on exercise selection is the speed of the movement. So again, you need to follow a logical speed progression model. An example of this, for example, would be a kind of split stance Romanian deadlift. That's obviously performed at a slow velocity, still with that single leg emphasis on the lead leg. Progression wise, you'd then be looking at the kind of reverse step into the split stance Romanian deadlift, or what we'd also call a reverse step and reach. Why is that a progression? Well, now you're stepping back and dropping down much quicker, so the eccentric loading is going to be greater on that lead leg just because of the speed of the movement. The third progression then would be the forward step into that split stance Romanian deadlift, or just a forward step and reach. Why is that a progression? Well, again, it's going to be performed at a pretty similar speed, but we're going to get additional ground reaction forces as you do that forward step. So the speed of the eccentric phase plus any additional ground reaction forces, or GRF as we usually shorthand write them, will increase the load on that lead leg as you progress through the 3 different movements or exercises. Stance is another consideration. So adopting a wider stance with the feet slightly turned out is the way we usually tend to kind of perform it. As we see on the left hand side of the images below, with the load going between the feet, is going to help us to recruit more medial hamstring. So that's generally the kind of stance we'd adopt for those kind of pull throughs or for kettlebell swings, which is why we tend to get a little bit more medial hamstring recruitment with those. With the feet, generally if we're performing that same kind of hip extension movement with like a Romanian deadlift, we generally would go with feet about hip width apart, usually kind of feet just normally pointing forward in a comfortable stance. So we're not going to get as much medial recruitment as we would do with the first stance. And then we can look at the reps. So the hamstrings respond well to lower rep ranges, such as heavy eccentric training. They also respond well to kind of shorter time under tension, which we're going to generally get with more kind of reactive strength training. And the reason is because they are much more kind of fast twitch muscles. We do also always need to kind of apply that strength for capacity training, so it's not great if you can only perform a few reps if you need to go out for a run or whatever else. But in particular, when we're looking at our strength training aspects, it is better to go with more fast twitch training rather than more kind of slow twitch style training. That's a mouthful. So on the exercise selection, you'd want to include both hip torque and knee torque exercises. You'd want to look to strengthen the adductor magnus because it's also a main kind of hip extensor, and you'd want to focus on strengthening the core muscles, both anterior, posterior and lateral. You also want to strengthen the glutes and lats because they form part of the posterior oblique system, which will help for running and for hip extension. On the mobilization, stretching and self-myofascial release or myofascial release by a practitioner on plantar fascia, calves and erector spinae may also assist with hamstring compliance at a fascial level. Now we did mention this before, but doing a leg extension range of motion test, both pre and kind of post the main session, is a very good thing to get into the habit of. So it's a test effectively for hamstring compliance. The optimal range of motion is within 10 degrees of full extension or full extension if you can kind of get there. So you need to be in this kind of upright seated position to accurately test for that. So we would use both pre and post hamstring main session in order to test the hamstring response to the kind of program. So if we see a deterioration in the test outcome, i.e. you can't lift it up to the range of motion that you had before, that would indicate a kind of poor response to the program you've just implemented or the session you've just implemented. Now we can look at what we would recommend as some of the essential equipment that you'd want within your facility to do hamstring training. One of which, and probably the main one that we would recommend, would be to get a glute ham raise machine. Generally the difference between strength and conditioning facilities and most other kind of strength training facilities like health clubs and gyms is whether they have a glute ham raise machine. Very unusual to see them, but they are a fantastic piece of kit if you know how to use them properly. Kneeling leg curl. So this helps us to very easily kind of train one hamstring at a time as knee flexor. Again, less common to see these kind of kneeling leg curl machines, but they are a very, very good way of training your hamstrings as knee flexor one leg at a time. And then we have our prone leg curl. Again, most people would kind of say they prefer to do a seated leg curl. We would always recommend a prone leg curl as a superior exercise. Again, still a knee flexion movement, but it will work very good for increasing the kind of cross-sectional area of different hamstring muscles, plus the adductors, and even getting good glute activation as you're performing them. So if you've got a choice between a seated leg curl and a prone leg curl, go with the harder prone leg curl. And then if you've got a choice, we could also go with something like an angled back extension. This will allow us to perform kind of back extension movements at different angles rather than just the kind of the standard position that you would get with a glute ham raise machine. It also allows us to do weighted stuff quite easily. So we could hold a barbell, for example, and do movements where we're kind of doing that loaded or heavily loaded back extension using something like that. So on the programming side, we want to follow a kind of gradual progression upwards. You don't want to follow it in a linear pattern, so you're just adding more and more load. You want to kind of add stress by doing a kind of higher intensity training, and then look and applying that strength into kind of capacity. And we look to do that with kind of each phase, if you like. So we would kind of start off getting them into kind of basic strength movements, maybe just with body weight initially, and making sure they can perform those at a reasonable level. And then we would start to look at increasing the capacity by maybe putting those exercises into a little mini circuit. Then we'd follow that strength progression, gradually building, doing more eccentric strength work, and getting heavier and heavier and really increasing the eccentric overload. You could then look to do a little bit more capacity work, maybe by then switching back to switching to single leg more training. Because you're doing it in more kind of a single leg dominance, you don't really want, it's much more difficult to kind of really get heavy with that because it is more unstable. So it lends itself to a little bit more capacity work. And obviously then when we're doing this single leg training, it also helps us to correct any bilateral strength differences and to work the body in a little bit more frontal and transverse plane as well. Once we've kind of set ourselves up with a solid eccentric strength base and we've corrected these kind of bilateral strength differences, then we can kind of really look at applying that into speed, which is what the final phases are there for. So again, working on more power. So it's a subtle progression where you're kind of moving from the kind of eccentric, maybe slower eccentric strength loading and gradually adding more velocity to that. It's not just simply, right, we finish 1 week there and then we're suddenly doing everything at super fast speed. We can gradually implement that. But yeah, we're looking at trying to teach the body now to generate more power. We're also really trying to apply that eccentric loading at speed. So can you decelerate well? And then it's really about applying that to then absorbing that eccentric loading and helping us to generate more force on the concentric phase, which is what we refer to as kind of reactive strength training, where we're getting our stretch shortening cycle really kicking in. Then it's all about applying that into coordination. So can you do running drills, maybe lighter plyometric drills, gradually building up into harder plyometric drills, but lighter plyometric drills with more capacity style coordination work? Do you have the ability to control the kind of limb speed as well? So if you are accelerating into knee extension quickly, can your knee flexors kind of control that limb speed? And obviously we can kind of integrate some of that later coordination work with exercises that we've done previously. So you may want to add in, hip bridging and things like that, just to make it a nice varied circuit. So an example of a kind of one of the phase one kind of more rehab type sessions, we would do these kind of seated knee extensions to test mobilization or mobility. And then we can do some power band, hamstring mobilization, some myofascial release using the ball, into supine floor bridges, planking for the core, 90-90 mobilization for the hip rotators, and some bodyweight sumo squats. And so what we tend to do now is, again, you kind of see we're kind of looking at alternating some lighter bodyweight resistance work, so sumo squats to work the hamstrings isometrically and work the adductors, and then into a kind of supine dead bug to work the core, some bodyweight inchworms, again, to get a little bit more mobility through the hip extensors, into a split stance Romanian deadlift, again, just body weight, into side plank for the lateral core, some lateral lunges, and then again, testing a seated knee extension range of motion at the end of that session to check to see how the hamstrings have coped with it. Basic strength session may look like this, where we're doing some, again, exercises are very much dependent on the injury that's occurred, but we may do something like a Romanian deadlift, a little bit lighter, kind of 2-3 sets of 6 to 8 reps, and then a wide leg press to work adductors, and then some prone leg curls. So we're doing some hip extension there, some kind of isometric hamstrings with this leg press movement, and then some knee flexion with the prone leg curls. Into some isometric back extensions to work the spinal erectors, and then into some standing calf raise as well to kind of link it in all along that posterior sling system. Parallel exercises, stable exercises, those are the kind of big key criteria. You want to start slowly on both intensity and volume, so as not to overload that area, and you can look to then gradually increase that intensity over a period of time, over a number of sessions. Applying that into then capacity work, so we may do like a little circuit. So we could start off with stability ball sumo squats, and we're doing that for anywhere between 30 and 60 seconds. So at a minimum, we do 30 seconds on each of these exercises, so it'd be 2 minutes in total. 60 seconds on each would take us up to obviously 4 minutes on total. So we do maybe 30 seconds of sumo squats, and then straight into suspension system leg curls, into bench bridging, and again we can do that slower or faster, and then into kettlebell swings. Rest for 30 seconds and repeat for a total of 2 to 4 circuits. So again, we can start off with a smaller amount of volume and then gradually increase that over a period of time. Again, we're sticking with stable parallel exercises, looking at gradually increasing the work capacity, but keeping it at a lower intensity throughout each of the exercises. As we really then start to up the stress on the muscle, then an example kind of stress session, we may only be picking 1 or 2 key exercises where we're really increasing the overload. So we're doing maybe a kind of 5 rep max type of thing. And we may do somewhere between 3 to 5 sets on those exercises. So here's an example. We may do sumo front squats with a barbell and linking with kind of razor curls then. So again, strengthening the adductors, hamstrings isometrically, and then pairing that or working within the same main session, razor curls, focusing on a predominantly kind of knee flexion stress or overload. Again, keeping them parallel stable exercises, building the intensity, keeping it with low reps, relatively low volume as well. You must build up to do this. That's very important. Just don't go straight in with 5 sets of 5 reps straight away. And one of the big things is if you apply it too much too soon, then you're going to get this delayed onset of muscle soreness, and too much DOMS will decrease program adherence with both athletic and non-athletic clients. And so it becomes much less beneficial if you may have the perfect program, but if they're not going to perform it, then it's not much point. If you wanted to add more volume during that kind of phases 2 and 3, then we could kind of migrate to doing a little bit more kind of volume training. In this case, this is an example. You could apply that like a pre-post exhaust tricep. So we'd be pairing a kind of knee flexion exercise, which we perform as the first and third exercise, as a kind of isolation exercise. And then we do a compound hip extension movement as the second exercise. So here's an example. We could do prone leg curls, where we do 8 to 10 reps. Then you perform a Romanian deadlift, 6 to 8 reps, and then go back to the prone leg curl where you do another 6 to 8 reps. Take about 10 seconds rest in between. You then rest for about 90, 120 seconds, and then repeat for a total of kind of 2 to 4 sets, or 2 to 4 trisets rather. Single leg capacity session. So we're predominantly kind of choosing single-sided or single leg dominant exercises. So again, we perform these as a circuit for the capacity side of things. So we may do dumbbell alternating walking lunges, 30 to 60 seconds of those. Then straight into single leg back extensions where we do 30 seconds on one leg, 30 seconds on the other leg. And that might only be kind of smaller range of motion with those. Into the kind of alternating dumbbell step and reach, again 30 to 60 seconds of that, and then finishing off with a single leg long lever bridging, again 30 seconds on one leg, 30 seconds on the other leg. Rest for 60 seconds and then again repeat for multiple circuits. So we're choosing more split stance or single leg emphasis exercises with these. It's going to add a little bit more frontal and transverse plane control. Obviously we're focusing on increasing the work capacity, but again the intensity is on the lower side in comparison with the stress sessions we showed you earlier. As we apply that strength then into more power, both development and control, then you may want to perform something like a heavy, fast, complex session. So what we're doing with this one is we're kind of performing a heavier, more stressful exercise initially, followed shortly afterwards by a fast, explosive exercise. So what we do with the heavy exercise is we're trying to stimulate the fast twitch fibers, so we don't actually want to take them to fatigue. So it is a harder exercise, but we're not going to a fatiguing state. So you may do something like a razor curl, so focusing on working the the knee flexors, and you do a few reps of those to stimulate those fast twitch fibers, short rest, and then you're going to go into the fast heel kicks on the stability ball, where we're looking at, again, maybe 15-20 seconds maximum intensity. Rest for a couple of minutes and repeat maybe 3 to 5 times. You could also do something similar from more the hip extension side of things, where we're doing these power band Romanian deadlift oscillations, where we're trying to stimulate that kind of that reactive aspect and get the fast twitch fibers switching on, and then linking that with a sled push for maybe kind of 20 seconds at a time. Again, rest for a couple of minutes and repeat for a number of sets. As we start to apply these into more coordination, we could do more eccentric capacity sessions. So what we're doing here is you're having a bit of rest in between. So we do these as a circuit. So we're doing eccentric jumping landings. It's not going to be that high intensity because obviously you have to reset with each repetition. So as you kind of control the landing, you're then going to step back up. So the 30 seconds worth of work shouldn't be hugely hard. It's just we're trying to increase our ability to control this for a longer period. You could then do these kind of kneeling hip extension oscillations, followed by barbell walking lunges with oscillations or dumbbell walking lunges with oscillations, and then into the kind of power bomb kettlebell swing. So with a partner, again. So what we're looking at here is we're really trying to increase the eccentric aspect. Some of these we're just increasing the eccentric load, and it's very much just eccentric control. So with the first one and the second one, the first one and the last exercise in particular is a lot more eccentric loading. With the second and third, we're getting a little bit more on the kind of reactive component, where we're trying to really stimulate the muscle spindles with the stretch shortening cycle, doing these oscillations. An example reactive strength density session would be that we're really trying to do these very quickly, moving from an eccentric to concentric contraction. But we're also with these exercises trying to perform as many reps as possible, and that's what the AMRAP stands for, as many reps as possible within a 30-second period. So we do 3 exercises, maybe fast suspension system leg curls, battle rope Romanian deadlifts, and bench bridge leg swaps, 30 seconds of each. Do as many reps as you can within that period, moving straight from one exercise to the next. Rest for 2.5 minutes or so, and then repeat. And as within the kind of towards the end of this phase, then this specific preparation phase, we're looking at trying to increase the functional capacity. So we're doing capacity training, but with more kind of functional style movements. So here we have kind of 5 exercises, running drills where you're going from high knees to straight legs. You do that for 30 seconds. You might do high knees for kind of 5-8 seconds, and then swap and just keep on swapping every 5-8 seconds. Next exercise into bench bridging, where you're doing that nice and fast, 30 seconds, into paused sprints, then into wobbles and flicks, and then finishing off with forwards skipping. So you may do forwards skipping for 5 seconds and then backwards run for 5 seconds, and repeat that for maybe 30 seconds or so. So that's the end of this presentation. On the review questions, you should now complete the review questions for this module to ensure you've met the learning outcomes, and complete the guided practice for this module, details of which are on the learner management system. So to on the guided practice, you want to complete some of the example hamstring workout sessions that we've just shown you. So just to consolidate what we've gone through with this workshop, the objectives of this workshop were to give you an understanding of the incident rates, risk factors, the pathophysiology and mechanics of hamstring injuries, understand how researchers approach the concept of different hamstring strengthening and rehabilitation using different training modalities, and also to understand how strength imbalances can affect the occurrence rate and reoccurrence rate in sports, and then to give or for you to gain knowledge and experience of how to carry out hamstring specific strengthening exercises and how to program and add these exercises and different types of training into the workouts of your clients or athletes. So to complete this workshop, ensure you've watched all of the presentations, ensure you've completed the review questions for each section. You want to complete any necessary guided learning practice and log this using the form on the system, and then complete the workshop quiz so you can see that you've understood the material. Once you've completed these steps, the workshop will be marked as completed on the system and your certificate will become available for you to access.